Kale carefully entered the abandoned manor, his footsteps echoing off the stone floors as he examined the faded masterpieces hanging on the decaying walls. As an art curator, he had seen his fair share of forgotten collections, but there was something unusually captivating about this place. Perhaps it was the tragic silence, or the strange feeling that hung in the air. He knelt before an old, broken painting that had fallen off the wall. It depicted a figure, pale and regal, a beauty trapped in time. The image stirred something in Kale's heart, a strange familiarity, but he couldn't put his finger on why. As he moved to turn the painting over to inspect it, he accidentally cut his finger on a jagged piece of the broken frame. The sting made him hiss, and his blood dripped onto the painting's edges. The moment the red liquid touched the artwork, the temperature in the room dropped. Kale froze, shivers crawling down his spine as the faint sound of shifting from the shadows filled the air. He barely had time to register the strange sensation before something, or someone, moved behind him. Davin's eyes snapped open. The sharp, alluring scent of fresh blood invaded his senses, pulling him out of centuries of slumber. His fangs extended instinctively as he rose from the coffin-like bed where he had lain dormant for so long. Every muscle in his body was screaming in hunger and desperation, but the scent of blood was different, foreign, and yet so familiar. The strange energy in the air told him this blood was connected to the man who dared disturb his tomb. He moved with the grace and speed of an ancient predator, his senses guided by the intoxicating aroma. When he finally saw Kale, hunched over the painting with blood trickling from his finger, Davin froze. The sight of Kale, the way the blood welled up from the wound and stained his skin, was enough to bring him to the edge of madness. But it was the connection, the strange bond he felt coursing through his veins, that stopped him. Davin's heart, long cold, thudded painfully in his chest. The blood that lay before him was his, an ancient and forbidden link that he couldn't yet understand. His eyes flickered with both hunger and curiosity. The bond wasn't simply one of a vampire's thirst, there was something far deeper at play. It called to him like the pull of fate. Kale turned suddenly, sensing the cold presence behind him. He looked up, eyes wide in terror as he stared at the tall, dark figure in the doorway. Davin stood tall, his eyes glowing with an unnatural gleam. His pale skin contrasted sharply with the dark shadows of the room, and the raw intensity in his gaze sent a chill racing through Kale's veins. The silence was broken only by the sound of Kale's breathing, quick and shallow. Who are you?" Kale whispered, stepping backward instinctively. His eyes darted nervously to the still bleeding cut on his finger. Davin's voice was low and dangerous as he answered, his tone sending a tremor through Kale. "I am Davin," he said, his gaze never leaving Kale. "And you, curiously enough, are in my domain." Kale didn't know what to make of the man before him, but one thing was clear, he was no ordinary man. His presence was too powerful, too overwhelming. As the blood still trickled from his finger, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a dangerous turn. Kale's pulse thudded in his ears as he took an instinctive step back. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the towering figure before him. There was something ancient about Davin, something that made his heart race with fear and an inexplicable pull. The blood he had spilled still lingered in the air, almost as if it had awakened something in the manor. Davin's piercing gaze never wavered. His nostrils flared, inhaling deeply, savoring the scent of the blood that was still fresh in the air. He had been asleep for far too long, his existence stretched over centuries, with little more than a distant memory of human connection. Yet now, in the presence of this man, everything felt different. The blood, the bond, this wasn't a random intruder. This was something far more significant. Kale took another step back, his mind foggy from fear. What do you want?" he asked, his voice trembling despite himself. He didn't know why, but he was certain that this man, this thing, was dangerous. The way his eyes glowed, the unnatural stillness in the air, it was as if he were standing in front of a predator that had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Davin's lips curled into a faint smile, revealing a flash of sharp, white fangs that gleamed in the dim light. "What I want," he said, his voice calm and dark, "is something you've already offered me." Kale's heart skipped a beat. "Offered? I didn't." "You've spilled your blood in my presence," Davin interrupted, his voice dripping with an unsettling, dark amusement. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them with a predator's grace. "And now I'm awake." He extended his hand, fingers curled, his gaze flickering to Kale's wound. Kale instinctively drew his hand back, panic rising within him. "Stay away from me." He didn't know what kind of monster this man was, but the way he spoke, the way he moved, it was inhuman. Davin's expression softened slightly, but his eyes glowed brighter with hunger. "Relax, I won't bite, unless you ask me to." The words hung in the air, teasing, and yet carrying a weight of truth that Kale couldn't ignore. He felt as if his very soul was being drawn toward the man. Kale's breathing quickened. What did he mean? Was he truly a vampire? And more importantly, why did Kale feel like this, like he was on the edge of something he couldn't escape? Before Kale could respond, Davin's gaze flickered to his hand. "Your blood is familiar," he murmured, more to himself than Kale. "I've tasted it before. But not in this life." He took a step back, as if wrestling with a surge of emotion. How curious. Kale, his heart racing, instinctively tried to pull himself together. His thoughts were muddled, but he had to find a way to protect himself. "What do you mean, you've tasted it before?" His voice was shaky but strong with defiance. Davin's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into something between a smirk and a frown. "It seems you've stumbled upon something much larger than you realize," he said softly, as if explaining something he didn't entirely understand. "But it's not yet time to explain it all." Kale's mind was spinning. The broken painting on the floor, the strange connection he felt to this man, was this fate? Or was it something far darker? Davin let out a low breath, his demeanor shifting from hunger to something colder, more calculated. "For now, you're safe. But I advise you not to wander too far." His voice dropped to a whisper, almost imperceptible. "There are things in this house that are better left undisturbed." Kale, still confused but finding a shred of courage, took another step back. "I don't care about your house or your curse. I just want to leave." Davin studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Very well. But be warned," he said, voice low and commanding, "the moment you step foot inside this manor, there's no going back." With that, Davin turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Kale standing there, his heart pounding in his chest. Kale looked around, trying to steady his nerves. He had a feeling that whatever had just transpired was only the beginning, and he had no idea what he had truly gotten himself into. As he left the manor, the sensation of being watched never left him. But more than that, there was an unsettling thought tugging at the back of his mind. Davin was right. He had awoken something that tied them both together. And now, Kale was certain that his life would never be the same again.